Díomh Mágin agus Fáiltearó go dtí ard ofic an Phuist. Agus welcome to the GPO in Dublin and to the commemoration this morning of the 90th anniversary of the Easter Rising. For the first time in more than 30 years, members of the Defence Forces will parade through the centre of Dublin to honour those who took up arms in the cause of Irish freedom 90 years ago. Our cameras this morning are live along the parade routes through the centre of Dublin, here at Dublin Castle, from where the parade will set off in just over 40 minutes from now. Also at Kilmainham Jail, where a little earlier this morning the Taoiseach and members of the government laid a wreath in memory of those executed in Kilmainham Jail in the aftermath of the Rising. And also at Áras an Uachtaráin, where the President will set out in just a little while to be the guest of honour here at the ceremonies at the GPO. Well, now the crowds are already gathering here in the centre of Dublin. Among them is Mary Kennedy. Mary.
Thanks, Brian. Well, mar dúirt tú tána fluid te balahansa I lorna carach fan ócáid mhór clína consa wid ag tuairt onóra dus Medina Lockport in Iria Machnacos and Éideag Séideag. Very shortly now the dignitaries will be arriving here outside the GPO. The Minister for Defence, the Taoiseach, agus Uachtaráin na Héireann, Morna Machialis, a Denig Kigarachs an Garda Onora here, the Guard of Honour taken from the 65th Infantry Reserve Infantry Brigade at McKee Barracks. Agus Dachtina an seo a glína an Iria Mach, agus a stain of almost was Medina at Lockport on.
Thank you, Mary. Well, the events of that week 90 years ago, of course, are for even those who remember the period but a distant memory. The motives of many of those who took part were varied and complex. The military objectives at the outset were distinctly unclear, and of course for those who took part the outcome was unknowable and unknown. On Easter Monday, April 24th, 1916, Patrick Pearse stood in front of the GPO in Dublin and read a proclamation announcing the establishment of an Irish Republic. It was a watershed moment in Irish history, the beginning of an armed insurrection to take Ireland, which had lost its own parliament under the Act of Union in 1801, on its first steps to freedom. The Easter Rising took place against a backdrop of national and international crisis. In 1912, a bill was introduced to the British House of Commons designed to grant Home Rule to Ireland, greatly increasing political tension in the country. Unionists, led by Sir Edward Carson, established the Ulster Volunteer Force in 1913 to resist Home Rule by force of arms. More than 100,000 men enlisted and were trained by retired officers of the British Army. Nationalists responded by forming the Irish Volunteers in November 1913 at a meeting at the Rotunda in Dublin. When this militia was endorsed by John Redmond, the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, its membership grew to more than 150,000. Both the Ulster Volunteers and the Irish Volunteers imported arms as divisions within the country worsened. The Home Rule Act was formally passed in 1914, but its implementation was immediately suspended after the United Kingdom and Germany went to war in August of that year. Both Carson and Redmond urged their respective volunteer forces to join the war effort. Irishmen from both traditions joined the British Army, but a minority of the Irish Volunteers, with Patrick Pearse and Tom Clarke in the vanguard, split from the Redmondite majority. They were determined to use the war to assert Irish independence through armed insurrection. On Easter Monday 1916, Pearse, Clark and an IRB-led section of the volunteers seized control of buildings in Dublin. There were also risings in Wexford and Galway. Joining the rebellion were members of the Irish Citizen Army, led by James Connolly and formed in 1913 to protect trade unionists, and members of Commemorate, who were amongst the many women to play an active role in the rising. British reinforcements and the use of artillery, including a gunboat on the Liffey, overwhelmed the rebels. On Friday, with the GPO in flames, the leaders retreated to provisional headquarters off Moore Street. The next day, Saturday, April 29th, Patrick Pearse surrendered unconditionally. In all, 62 volunteers had been killed, as had 132 members of the Crown forces and more than 250 civilians. The city centre had been devastated. The rebels' dreams appeared crushed. Many who had taken part in the rising were interned in prison camps in Wales. Others, including all the leaders, were tried by military court-martial. Between May 3rd and May 12th, 15 of them, including all the signatories of the proclamation, were executed by firing squad. Thomas Kent in Cork, and the other 14, including Pearse and Connolly, in Kilmainham jail. It was a bloody end to the Easter Rising, but the start of a new era in Ireland's history. Well, it was in Kilmainham jail that this morning's ceremonies began. The Taoiseach, accompanied by the Chief of Staff of the Defence Forces and the Commander of the 2nd Eastern Brigade, laid a wreath in memory of those 14 leaders of the rising executed here in the Stonebreakers Yard. A period of silence was observed in memory of all those who took part in the rising.
Today is a day of remembrance and reconciliation and renewal. Today is about discharging one generation's debt of honour to another. Today we are fittingly commemorate the patriotism and vision of those who set in train an unstoppable process which led to this country's political independence.
The Taoiseach speaking at Kilmainham jail a little earlier today. When joining me is the broadcaster and historian Dermot Ferreter, who's been writing and has written extensively on the events before, during and in the aftermath indeed of 1916. Dermot, can I ask you first of all, we know a lot about the leaders who took part in the rising, the men who we've just spoken about, who were executed in Kilmainham and elsewhere, but what about the ordinary men and women who turned up, 400 of them who turned up here at the GPO on that Easter Monday? What do we know about them and their motives and what they were expecting and hoping?
Well, the motives of the rank and file were many and varied, I suppose, like the leaders, you could say, but they were ordinary men and women. This was a very small city back then. There was only 304,000 people who lived in Dublin. 55% of those who were arrested after the rising were labourers, so many ordinary working class men and women. Many of them members of the 4 battalions of the Dublin Volunteers, the Irish Citizens Army, James Connolly's army, and of course Commemorate, the women who were involved in 1916 as well. So they came here wanting to hold out as long as possible. There was an awful lot of confusion in the couple of days beforehand. A lot of people didn't know exactly what was planned. So many people joined in during the week. So there was actually only 150 originally in the GPO, but by midweek there was about 450 people there.
What about their expectations in the aftermath, and over many years it was seen as militarily a hopeless cause, but new evidence that's emerging from the records of those who actually took part, their accounts, suggest that perhaps that wasn't the full picture.
Well, the problem was that we don't have the accounts of the military committee of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, so we don't know why they chose the GPO, for example. We don't know why they decided to seize some of the key main buildings. What we do know is that they wanted to hold out for as long as they possibly could. The idea was that they would, in particular, not do what had been done with Robert Emirett's rebellion, where it would be over in 24
Well, now,
hours.
as you can see, the President is just leaving Ars an Uachtaráin to make the short journey here into the centre of Dublin. She will travel, indeed, in the final stages of that journey, the route which will be taken by the parade this morning. She'll be coming down the quays, crossing the Liffey at Parliament Street, and then coming down Dame Street and up and into O'Connell Street. And the President, of course, who has made her own contribution to the debate surrounding 1916 in a recent speech in UCC in Cork. She urged that there be a national debate, Dermot, about the meaning of 1916 and what we should take from it today.
Well, I think it's fair to say she probably lit the fuse there at that stage, and we have been having a national debate. It's also been a chance, I suppose, to talk about neglected aspects of 1916. There was a time when the only focus was on the leadership. We now have the Bureau of Military History statements which give us an overview of what the rank and file felt, a mixture of exhilaration, defiance, fear and so on. That it was quite a complex event, an awful lot of confusion about it. But it's a chance as well to look at filling in the gaps. You know, there are a number of gaps that we still have, and we're getting closer to, I suppose, a more definitive account of what happened.
What about the reaction of ordinary people here in Dublin and around the country to the rising? Now, again, the conventional view has been that the insurgents who were led away from here were spat at by the people of Dublin. But again, we're getting perhaps a more complete picture of the reaction.
I think it's a mixture of anger and pride, because I mean, obviously people were inconvenienced by it. There was an awful lot of anger at the fact that food supplies might be in danger and so on. But at the same time, I think the longer they held out, the more pride that was developing even during the week itself. The idea that they were actually putting up a good fight, the idea that they were not going to be humiliated in the way that people thought it might be over by Monday night or Tuesday morning. And ordinary people began to gather around the GPO, down around St. Stephen's Green. They too were bewildered with what was going on, but they were also intensely curious.
Well, now we're just seeing pictures of the Minister for Defence, Willie O'Dea, who's arriving to be greeted by the Guard of Honour, which has been assembled here at the GPO. This is the Presidential Guard of Honour, which will be offering a salute to Minister O'Dea in his capacity as Minister for Defence. Members of the Guard of Honour, the Presidential Guard of Honour, drawn from the 65th Reserve Infantry Battalion, which is located at McGee Barracks here in Dublin. And by convention, the Guard of Honour comprises 100 members of the Defence Forces of all ranks, men and women. Many of them with connections, indeed, personal family connections to those who took part in the rising. O'Dea then is escorted to his position on the podium here among members of the government, the Dáil and Seanad, members of the diplomatic corps. And only the President will inspect the Guard of Honour. The Guard of Honour offers a general salute, first as we saw to the Minister for Defence, and now in just a moment to the Lord Mayor of Dublin, Councillor Catherine Byrne, whose car you can see just there in the centre of your picture. And the officer commanding the Guard of Honour, you saw him there a moment ago, Captain Damien O'Toole.
The Lord Mayor of Dublin is Captain Byrne, is now arriving on stage.
The Lord Mayor is escorted forward, again to receive the General Salute, and she's accompanied there by the Assistant Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Dan Ray, and by the Director of Personnel for the Defence Forces, Colonel Bob Fitzgerald. say, the Guard of Honour from the Reserve Defence Forces, formerly known as the FCA. Indeed, it's worth perhaps noting that a number of members of the Guard of Honour this morning took part in the celebrations to mark the 50th anniversary of the Rising in 1966. They are Battalion Sergeant Major Tom O'Kelly, Company Quartermaster Sergeant Brian Kenny, and Sergeant John Delaney. So the Guard of Honour now will stand by for the arrival of the Taoiseach, who is the final dignitary to arrive before the President is escorted here to her position, and as I say, to inspect the Guard of Honour. Well, now, as I say, Dermot Carter is with us here. Dermot, it's, as we said, more than 30 years, 1971 on the last occasion on which 1916 was commemorated with a military parade. A lot of controversy and discussion, of course, about the appropriateness of that. But I suppose the message today, which the government will want to convey, is that we see here today Óglaigh Nahair, and his ministers have been reminding us, is the title of the army, under the command of the democratically elected leaders of this state.
This is one of the things that was very controversial, I suppose, in recent years, the extent to which you should be celebrating or commemorating the militaristic side of it.
Now, as you can see, Mr. O'Hearn has arrived, and he has been escorted to the Guard of Honour to receive his salute. And of course, today's ceremony very much the initiative of Mr. O'Hearn. He announced that this parade would take place at the Fianna Fáil Ardèche last October, and at the time said that perhaps worth recalling the words of the Taoiseach in that address to the Fianna Fáil Ardèche last October. He said, in relation to the participation, the central role of the Defence Forces in today's ceremonies, he said that the Defence Forces are, and I quote, the only legitimate army of the Irish people, the true successors of the volunteers. The spirit of 1916, he said, is our state's inheritance. We must protect it from those who will abuse it and from the revisionists who would seek to denigrate it. In a sense, Dermot Carter, this is the establishment, if you like, reclaiming perhaps 1916 and the memory of 1916?
Well, it's inevitable that with an event like 1916 it will be used and it will be abused as well. You had the official commemoration in 1966, which is very elaborate, but you also had the unofficial commemoration, which was, I suppose, blowing up Nelson's pillar. That became kind of the iconic image of the 1966 Jubilee celebration. So it's always been a delicate issue. I think there have been rows about commemorations over the year about the extent to which particular individuals will hijack it and so on. There seemed to have been an intense irritation, perhaps, in more recent years that Sinn Féin were making the running with regard to commemoration. There certainly has been an attempt to claim that back, not just by Fianna Fáil, but perhaps to a certain extent by people who are involved in the research of it as well, that they are seeking to bring out the complexity of the event as opposed to it being something that was very simple, something that was to be remembered solely in terms of the military sacrifices, solely in terms of the rhetoric about blood and so on. The idea that you have to incorporate all sorts of other aspects to it, the aspirations that the people had at the time, and the fact, of course, that there were so many people who were fighting in the First World War at the same time. You know, numerically, the people who were in the GPO were a tiny, tiny proportion of the amount of people who were bearing arms in Eastern 1916.
And they were, in fact, a majority, if you like, of advanced nationalist opinion at the time. Most of the volunteers didn't turn out because there was the famous countermanding order.
There was. That was part of the confusion that existed. And there were also those who, even though they disagreed, wanted to be there to see the final product. You know, there was a famous line from the O'Reilly that he had been involved in winding up the clock, and he wanted to be there to see it strike, even though he did not agree that this was the thing to be done. And Roger Casement was, of course, coming across to try and prevent the rising from happening.
Well, now there we see the President crossing Grattan Bridge and proceeding with her cavalcade up Parliament Street. That's the view from below City Hall, and the cavalcade there turning left into Dame Street and picking up what will be the route of this military parade this morning. The President's car there turning the corner, and you can see the crowds lining the street all the way up there to the entrance to Dublin Castle. And as I said earlier, President Macauley's indeed an active participant in the debate that is currently taking place about the meaning of 1916. But here today, of course, as head of state in her second term as Uachtaráin na hÉireann, and of course as Commander-in-Chief of the Defence Forces, a role in which both she and I know members of the Defence Forces take great pride, and that's signified by the military escort, of course, which is bringing her now down Dame Street. You see the front of Trinity College there, which was not occupied by the insurgents in 1916. It was held by a small group of reserve trainees in the British Army inside Trinity College. And there you can see the crowds lining several deep and more, I should think, at College Green as the cavalcade moves slowly across the heading for O'Connell Bridge now. Some suggestions that perhaps up to 100,000 people might turn out to see the ceremony this morning. We shall see when the figures come out later, but certainly substantial crowds all along this route here as the President's motorcade passes down Westmoreland Street and now crossing O'Connell Bridge and into O'Connell Street.
Tunis as code Artifican first a Tom Podium and what's in country. Lieutenant General James Freenan, agus Africa Huaymocan, Dara Brigade and Etter on Cornell Tommy Behan. Agus the Rachel finish, na Kiggerach Umlana Yana at a Garden Ora, Kate Saidul, Carney Shaw as Doon Biki in Shaw a Doshkat na Carach, agus Genesis Kiggerach Shin, Ribbon Shamanos, Owash Gar of Etten Shaw. You can't finish a lot of the way there. John Ford in Shin, agus in Twachtron, Big Gill Isa.
And as we were saying earlier, the President will inspect the Guard of Honour drawn from the 65th Reserve Infantry Battalion, based at McKee Barracks.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're invited to stand.
President moves forward to her central position in the middle of the Guard of Honour from the captain in charge of the Guard of Honour. Of course, a 100-man Guard of Honour, always commanded by a captain, Captain Damien O'Toole, who is from the Reserve Defence Forces and works in a daily job in the GPO, so on familiar territory at the moment.
Guard in order! Cortege on Tiltron! Turning! Adam! Guard in order! All three! Adam!
Of course, all orders of command in the Defence Forces since its beginning given through the medium of the Irish language. And Captain Damien O'Toole going King Initiative Iroshe and Puchtaran, Kigirach Yana Erhard in Nora.
And now as President McAleese makes her way to inspect the Guard of Honour, it's interesting to note, Owen, what was said about the Irish fighters in 1916. The Prime Minister Asquith in the House of Commons said they conducted themselves with great humanity. They were young men, often lads, misled, I believe, into this terrible business. They fought very bravely and they didn't resort to outrage. And I tribute to the men who fought.
And as we look at the President walking down the front rank, we should remind us that these soldiers are drawn from the 65th Reserve Infantry Battalion based at McKee Barracks in Dublin. But in 1916, at McGee Barracks, then known as Marlborough Barracks, in response to the rising, the 6th Reserve Cavalry Regiment provided 100 men. So I suppose a poignant reminder, 100 men here in 206, there was also 100 men. In fact, Dublin, British troops garrisoned in Dublin could only provide 100 soldiers from 4 barracks. A total of 400 British soldiers responded in the initial phases of the rising.
And for their part, individual British soldiers spoke very highly of the rebels. They said they were the cleanest and the bravest lot of boys they'd ever met.
Jere leis gigirach den is agus an tuachtarán féile go dtí a síb lárnach an seo lár an paráid. Captain O'Toole requested permission from an tuachtarán to dismiss his parade. Tuachtarán Vicalisa will now be escorted to another central position for the next phase of the ceremony, which will be short phase of remembrance, where we will have the lowering of the national flag, we'll have the reading of the proclamation, and which will be followed by the laying of a wreath, a moment silent, and the rising of the national flag.
Agus
Guard in order!
Bratach na Drígá, Brat na Héireann, like se áislú, the lower creen, agrina agacha for boss and Iri amach. And the proclamation will be read in English as Pádraig Pearse read the proclamation just after midday on Easter Monday 1916, signalling the start of the rising.
Guard of Honour is now leaving O'Connell Street, making way for the brigade of troops, which will march by here shortly once the Tuachtarán has completed her part in the Shaman of Queen of Honor that's out in the Wish. He's done no matter.
And the Guard of Honour marching on to the sound of the flag of freedom. And as the tricolour will be lowered to half-mast in honour of those who died during Easter week, just think about the words of James Connolly on war. He said, "War might be a grim necessity, but it could not be welcomed, much less glorified. And when so waged, it must be waged thoroughly, relentlessly, but with no delusions as to its elevating nature. There's no such thing as humane or civilized war." The words of James Connolly.
Catherine David Fitzpatrick, Oscar Nonalpi, Americ and Piercig, Sagora and Chinachurt, Ordu, Balkoid, Saigiri. Lament being played there by Corporal Kevin Duncan. The lament wrapped the green flag, while the national flag was being lowered to half-mast. Out of view, the flag officer was Lieutenant Denise MacDonough.
And now the Master of Ceremonies, Captain Keith Murphy. He's from Roscommon.
Vi tut cora le harium of the Cosca. On an octrisha a Commemorate, agus a Kieluru in yo, Tom Captain Tomaso Rian, as Tunde Roscommon, Iviga on Shave Colhan Koshiha, Balya Alun, on an Ogra Ahur, Ivurlar, Osperla, Famar Ogriu or an Okas Spain, Imilinike, Ishishete. Ladies and gentlemen, in the afternoon of Easter Monday 1916, Pádraig Pearse and members of the Irish Volunteers emerged from the GPO. The Proclamation of Independence was read in English to the people of Ireland and the Easter Rising had begun. In order to commemorate the events of that day, Captain Tom Ryan from Roscommon and member of the 6th Infantry Battalion at Lome will now read the Proclamation of Independence.
And in fact, Captain Keith Murphy and Captain Tom Ryan, both from Roscommon, and both played inter-county football for the county.
To the people of Ireland, Irish men and Irish women, in the name of God and of the dead generations from which she received her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom. Having organised and trained her manhood through her secret revolutionary organisation, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and through her open military organisations, the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army. Having patiently perfected her discipline, having resolutely waited for the right moment to reveal itself, she now seizes that moment, and, supported by her exiled children in America and by gallant allies in Europe, but relying in the first on her own strength, she strikes in full confidence of victory. We declare the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland and to the unfettered control of Irish destinies, to be sovereign and indefeasible. The long usurpation of that right by a foreign people and government has not extinguished the right, nor can it ever be extinguished, except by the destruction of the Irish people. In every generation, the Irish people have asserted their right to national freedom and sovereignty. 6 times during the past 300 years, they have asserted it in arms. Standing on that fundamental right, and again asserting it in arms, in the face of the world, we hereby proclaim the Irish Republic as a sovereign, independent state, and we pledge our lives and the lives of our comrades in arms to the cause of its freedom, of its welfare, and of its exaltation among the nations. The Irish Republic is entitled to, and hereby claims, the allegiance of every Irish man and Irish woman. The Republic guarantees religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities to all its citizens, and declares its resolve to pursue the happiness and prosperity of the whole nation and of all its parts, cherishing all the children of the nation equally, and oblivious of the differences carefully fostered by an alien government which have divided the minority from the majority in the past. Until our arms have brought the opportune moment for the establishment of a permanent national government, representative of the whole people of Ireland, and elected by the suffrages of all her men and women, the provisional government hereby constituted will administer the civil and military affairs of the Republic in trust for the people. We place the cause of the Irish Republic under the protection of the Most High God, whose blessing we invoke upon our arms, and we pray that no one who serves that cause will dishonour it by cowardice, inhumanity, or rapine. In this supreme hour, the Irish nation must, by its valour and discipline, and by the readiness of its children to sacrifice themselves for the common good, prove itself worthy of the august destiny to which it is called. Signed on behalf of the Provisional Government, Thomas J. Clark, Sean McDermott, Thomas McDonough, P.H. Pearce, Eamon Kent, James Connolly, Joseph Plunkett.
Shara there, played by the Army No. 1 band, arranged by Commandant Mark Armstrong, who's conductor of the No. 1 band.
Gardnora Scananalti Egwai at Adam Ashamplia on symbol Idirnashunte and Numos Oshud Tahish Chichim Aga Agazinish Umplor and Corporal David Murphy, because in Corporal Paddy Darby, Lawyask, Ashia, Law and Freud, because Tura and Tisha, Kude, Conuchtaron, Lawyask Galyagan, Mar Huimnachan, or a Shoot of Fort Boss.
And as the wreath is brought into position, just think about the night before the execution of James Connolly, and his wife Lily visited him, and she said, "Your beautiful life, Jim, your beautiful life." And his reply was, "Wasn't it a full life, Lily, and isn't this a good end?" And Joseph Mary Plunkett, the night before he died, said to the Capuchin priest, Father Albert, that he was dying for the glory of God and the honour of Ireland.
Irmanisher and Lutheran, Lot at the Lion, or Count the Dini Galera for a boss. I now invite the President to lay a wreath on behalf of all those who died.
The President will lay the wreath, and that will be followed by a period of silence.
Is je noemt Domus bij een graden Kerry. Okay.
The last post there, played in honour of those who died in 1916. Pádraig Pearse, in his last letter to his mother, said, "You must not grieve for all of this. We've preserved Ireland's honour and our own. Our deeds of last week are the most splendid in Ireland's history. People will say hard things of us now, but we will be remembered by posterity and blessed by unborn generations."
Bratach ordú go bord Sean ag ní seo by na nótaí dúiseachta agus órán na bhíon agus. Ending this ceremony will be reveille with Óran na bhíon.
Now we see the parade setting off from under the arch, the entrance to Dublin Castle, the first of these 2,500 troops who will leave the castle, the upper yard of Dublin Castle, seat of British government for so many hundreds of years, of course, handed over in 1922, taken possession of by Michael Collins in the aftermath of the treaty. And the first group of troops you see there are carrying the flags of the nations in which Irish troops have acted as peacekeepers over more than 4 or 5 decades now, emphasizing the peacekeeping role of the defense forces, a modern role for a modern army. And this head of the parade, led by a band drawn from the band of the 1st Southern Brigade and the band of the 4th Western Brigade. And as the parade sets off down Dame Street, the President now will be escorted by the Chief of Staff to her viewing position on the stand, just to the left of the portico of the GPO. And the President there greeting members of the government, former Taoiseach Gareth Fitzgerald, Minister for Finance, Brian Cowan, Dermot Ahern I see there as well, Michael McDougall, his grandfather, of course, was Owen McNeill. Leaders of the opposition parties there, Trevor Sargent, Arthur Morgan representing Sinn Féin. And the President there taking her seat just in front of Rory O'Hanlon, Count Corla.
Ladies and gentlemen, today's parade will now begin. The first series of Defence Forces personnel past the viewing stand are being led by the Army No. 1 Band under the direction of Lieutenant Colonel Brendan Power from the Defence Forces School of Music. Included in this series is the national flag, Starry Flower and Old Republic flag.
The brand new in the Kate Saiduri come all be the who Kate Saidur. Gina Mala for Pushkan Clear, with Strata in the Carroff, Canassi and Barrage, Mealet the Shaw, top with Stewart on Brigadier General Jerry McNamara, on Canassi at Dora Brigade on Etter. Viewing the band as it marches, the leading element of this brigade of troops, over 2,500 soldiers drawn from all over the defence forces, both reserve and permanent defence forces. Looking at the brigade commander of the 2nd Eastern Brigade there, also parade commander today, Brigadier General Gerard McNamara.
We're looking at the flags now, and included in the serial is the national flag, the Starry Plough and the Old Republican flags. Flag groups carrying the national flags of countries where the Defence Forces personnel are currently serving, and also flags representing the units that have served overseas. Just a reminder that the Starry Plough was adopted as the flag of the Irish Citizen Army shortly after its inception in 1914.
Ik sto prachtig kunnen national ekensula nu wil aan roos Saiduri, als het half voor Saiduri go orsi kostenta de tire shaw again the sherby share kill na national die son shiachan at bottom down with a ban killing show go shriek froggy holland sitting through over at how bali la grano of a broad shot. looking at pennants of the various overseas units that served for units of the Defence Forces, battalion strength mainly, 88 in total, pennants or colours as they're often referred to, for various units which have served. And of course today is also a day of remembrance of the service of Irish soldiers around the world in the service of peace, which did not come at which was at huge sacrifice to the Defence Forces. In total, 85 members of the Defence Forces have lost their lives in the service of peace around the world. And we remember them today and the sacrifice of their families and indeed their comrades.
And now we are also joined by members of the Organisation of National Ex-Servicemen and Women and the Irish United Nations Veteran Association. They're marching behind the flag party. The current membership of 1,700, and they have 50 branches in Ireland and 3 in the United Kingdom.
Field Commander Gerald McNamara, Brigadier General, orders I left there as passes the reviewing platform. The Commander-in-Chief of the Defence Forces talked on Bickley. The National Colour Party there, national colours being carried by Captain Shay Kyo from the 2nd Brigade. Representative group from the cadet school passing the reviewing platform. Of course, it's fitting that the cadet school is strongly represented here today, because cadet school is located in Pierce Barracks in the Curragh, of course named after Torek MacPierce, Villa, Sideur, August Moonshine.
And they're marching to the strains of the White Cockade, which is giving way to the Bold Fenian Men. The officer marching with the band is Lieutenant Colonel Brendan Power, who's director of the Defence Forces School of Music.
Picturella gonna bratachi nú na dahani gonna cahalan exul the service harliar son shiachon as put down making sure 8 in Yumlan, 88 in total of these pennants operating here today. Of course 2 or 3 pennants also serving at the moment abroad in Liberia and Kosovo, where Irish soldiers are currently serving. The flags of nations there where Irish soldiers have served, and the ONE marching through the front.
And among their members are Paddy, who is a man from, he's 82 years of age, Paddy Hayes, Distinguished Service Medal, and he's from Cork, one of the first servicemen to be presented with the Distinguished Service Medal in 1965 by the then Minister for Defence, Paddy Hillary, for his service to the state.
The ONE has representative groups throughout the country, but also in England and the United States, and they're proudly marching through the street. And their colours and their medals remind us of the dedicated service and the loyal service given to by the Óglaigh na Héireann, the descendants of those who stood in front of the GPO in 1960.
Also among the ex-servicemen is Lieutenant General Jerry McNahan, DSM also, Distinguished Service Medal, taking part, and a former Chief of Staff of the Defence Forces.
The Blue Berets, we have the IUMBI, the Irish United Nations Veterans Association. They proudly parading with all their colours, of course the familiar blue beret of the United Nations. Final part of this first serial to pass the reviewing platform are 25-pounder artillery pieces that come from the 2nd Field Artillery Regiment. The view of both the ONE and the IUMBI grouping passing the reviewing platform there. British and the American military attaché, Colonel John Steed from the British Defence Attaché, as they're referred to now, and Colonel Paul Flynn of the United States military. More troops approach O'Connell Street. The last serial, or the last piece of equipment in the first serial of troops to pass by, there was 25-pounders, which I was referring to earlier, who are now used, probably the oldest piece of equipment in use in the Defence Forces, used for training purposes. 25-pounder artillery piece dates back to the Second World War, and these ones, which are used mainly for presidential gun salutes and ceremonial occasions, are splendidly prepared by members of the 2nd Field Artillery Regiment, also from McKee Barracks here in Dublin.
And as we remember back to the Easter Rising in 1916, it's interesting to think about the conditions that prevailed for the insurgents. The garrison, for instance, in Jacob's factory survived mainly on cakes and biscuits, and the City Hall garrison had porridge, and the Marylebone Lane, they fared considerably better.
Buin Dora Mehal Saiguri attack the staff of Stradian Funnel and Banakol or Droru staff of Quistur Comfort Mark Armstrong Mar Sturahod and Banakol Ibrahim and Adam of Molly Bloom or Casa Accompanish the Swatche Branor Tagan Dora Buin Saiguri Shaw or Dora Brigade and Etter at Lonely Hinshaw in Netter Nachira Block Lia Soso Hua Jerome the Cho.
Commandant Mark Armstrong there. Musicians here are from the Army No. 1 Band and the band of the 4th Western Brigade. This second serial will be accompanied by a fly past, and the formation is led by Commandant Jim Gavin, who's chief instructor in the flying training school. Served with the Permanent Defence Force for 15 years, and he was also a member of the Dublin senior football team, which won an All-Ireland final in 1995.
Troops of the 2nd Eastern Brigade there, passing the reviewing platform at the moment. Troops from the 2nd Eastern Brigade, mainly drawn from Colgrove Barracks, from McKee Barracks, from Aiken Barracks, all familiar names dating back to the time of the Rising 1916, even though Frank Aiken wasn't part of the Rising, he certainly played a key role in the War of Independence, which was to follow. Mujibrano and Shin Air Echelon, Machujan Air Corps, Shea Pilatus, Maradur Mary, Toffree Stewart, and Count for Jim Gavin, Agus Yet Getchel, Egamam Kena, Agus Ata, the Saiguri, Odor, and Kahalan, and Netter. Jerem Freud, you know, Chukono, Echelon Air Fad, like here, Agus Day, Shil Air Fad, Chudmakon, Hele, Fred, Swiss, The Green Berets, as we see here, represent the Reserve Defence Forces, the only distinction recognisable between members of the permanent defence forces, who wear the blackberries and the green colour of the PDF, or the RDF, the Reserve Defence Forces. Looking at an EOD display, an ordnance disclosure unit going by there with all its equipment. Of course, the EOD teams of the Defence Forces, or bomb disposal teams as they're known, not only provide that type of service here at home, but is a vital component of our overseas missions. And currently there are 2 EOD teams deployed in Liberia and in Kosovo, providing vital personal protection to the soldiers who serve there.
The explosive ordnance disposal or EOD stands now part of the GPO.
And we were talking earlier about how the insurgents managed during Easter week. Talking about Marrowbone Lane. On Wednesday, they managed to get some food. They got some chickens from the messenger boy. And on Thursday, the women got a cow and 2 calves. They made butter with the milk. A volunteer who was a butcher killed one of the calves. The following day, there were veal cutlets for breakfast. They were also doing well in the fighting. On Thursday, they resisted an attack by British troops. It's interesting just to know about the conditions that endured at the time.
Certainly the forefathers of Ogwe Mahaden, as they now are, would certainly not recognise the equipment, how well equipped the Defence Forces are. Of course, this is vital for the role that the Irish Defence Forces play around the world, where they punch way above their weight in terms of the contribution Irish soldiers have made to world peacekeeping. In total, it is estimated that over 55,000 Irish men and women have served with the United Nations around the world. Wydibranu goma artillera, pisa artillera, Kate agus 2 millimeter goma New Hampshire atá Sinavor Sukosinta Allaham Nakweda. As we look at the artillery going by there, we are reminded that during the siege of the GPO during 1916, 2 18-pound artillery pieces were brought to the city from Athlone. One was positioned at the Parnell Monument, and the other was positioned in just across the river in Delir Street, or in the Delir Street area. And of course, it was the artillery pieces which caused or forced the eventual evacuation of the GPO when the fires broke out within the GPO. As we see the artillery passing the reviewing platform, we're reminded of this.
The third serial is made up of Defence Forces personnel from both permanent and reserve units in the Southern Brigade. Lieutenant Colonel Matt Murray, who is a native of Pine, County Kildare, brings band.
Captain Declan Whitson leading the troops from the 1st Southern Brigade towards the reviewing platform. Of course, Brigade, Kate Brigade, Jeshkert, we stewed, Lieutenant Colonel Matt Murray. The few who were in Matt Murray in the Baltas, the Warsi Cosenta, Achatafi Mohid, Edias, who were Malam to the Balti Aram the Franca, Tashi Haryar, Dagger, La Aram the Franca, Inin, Kira Murray.
Owen was mentioning there, the daughter of Lieutenant Colonel Murray. It's interesting to reflect on the role of women in 1916. At first, the Commemorate were turned away from many of the garrisons, and then a directive went out to allow them to take part, and their role was a practical one. They staffed a field hospital established at the back of the GPO, and the kitchen of the GPO was placed under the control of Desmond Fitzgerald and also Louise Gavin Duffy. There were other instances, Catherine Byrne, names that are very familiar to us as we remember back to 1916. She entered the GPO through a window on Princess Street, and she was immediately called to tend to Liam Clark, who had been injured by a homemade bomb that accidentally exploded. No bandages to hand, so she tore up her clothes and used to dress his wound.
The view there of the Ministerial Air Transport Wing of the Air Corps. Sin gan na Saidúrí bhí éidir míleta agus iad na Marshall príosráidí chunan in sin. Nó óhád níos óige tá Saidúrí na Bhórsaí Cosanta na bhí sé blianta roimhe seo agus tríomh sé andí an arcíocht déaltaigh na Bhórsaí Cosanta agus is cinnte go meálam an méid trealamh New-Hampshire agus éidir New-Hampshire agus na Cuinealacha New-Hampshire atá ag na Bhórsaí Cosanta. We láthir go meálann sé sin Saidúrí. Cessnas an sin go chuid an airport trí clínicúb le feicáil láth na Huiriad bhí stúr Captain Mac Quinlan tá mhunaithe dar nó leis an airport céasmant éireann.
And also marching with this Southern Brigade is Private Gemma O'Connor, who was a member of last year's Cork Senior Camogie team, who won the All-Ireland, and she was a Camogie All-Star. She was a Vodafone Player of the Year and Munster Camogie Player of the Year in 2005. Private Gemma O'Connor taking part in today's military parade.
All go chúltacha na Bhórsaí Cosanta sin i dteachtas ceafa bhair. Thugad tíí ar bhóg sin go go mar eise sin. Pictiúr eile chun chúltacha in sin in teacht ó Canasíocht chun deisceart in sin. Trí chumplach in Iomlán ar paráid inniu ó Canasíocht in deisceart. Mar a dúirt me iad festíos na héide céna, díreach céna, an trealach ceana céna ach agus atá ag go ná Saidúrí na Saidúrí lán Hampshire. Bud de bhreanúir sin ar Móhags nó carnaí armor atá ag na Bhórsaí Cosanta iad ceannaí le gur i deagainn ag na Bhórsaí Cosanta agus iad ar seirbhís níomháin seo sa mhaile a char lear mar cosint agus mar choras iompar a bhaid go chéile chun na Bhórsaí Cosanta agus iad ar seirbhís idirnáisiúnta. View there of MOAG armoured personnel carriers, some of them mounted with .5 machine guns. MOAG is a new addition to the Defence Forces and are currently on deployment overseas with the Defence Forces, providing vital personal protection to our troops as they serve abroad in Liberia and in Kosovo. MOAGs now, 5 of them, passing the reviewing platform.
These vehicles are currently in service with the Defence Forces on overseas missions in Liberia, Sierra Leone and Kosovo. Members of the Irish Defence Forces have been...
Of course, the Irish Defence Forces has benefited greatly in the last few years of major injections of funding, which was brought about by the sale of some barracks, and that was directly transferred into the acquisition of the modern equipment that we see here on parade today, and it certainly has helped in no small way to bolstering the recruiting drive of the Defence Forces. And as we view the men and women of the Defence Forces on parade, you will note how young these soldiers are, and most of them, the vast majority of soldiers, have served overseas on more than one occasion through an awful lot of the world troubled areas. We're looking at some back again to the MOAG armoured cars, but following up on those we have some AML 60s, or sorry, AML 20s and AML 90s that are passing the reviewing platform.
It has the ability to clear sites for temporary
aerial view there of the O'Connell Monument and troops crossing the bridge.
And looking at the engineering float, last year 2 engineering officers travelled to Sri Lanka in the aftermath of the tsunami, and they took part in the road building programme so that access could be gained to remote villages.
The engineering float we are viewing is known as by the soldiers as a thresher, a mine thresher, which clears fields, minefields, and is vital for the safe transfer of troops across troubled areas where Irish soldiers are deployed around the world.
As the 4th serial. And they're from the Defence Forces Training Centre. The band, Sarki's Men, the Curragh Kildare being played, and that will lead through to, they're again under the baton of Commandant Mark Armstrong.
For the Curragh of Kildare, it's appropriate that they would play this when the Defence Forces Training Centre is located in the Curragh, and creating the link with the Rising of 1916, which we are celebrating here. We're reminded of the fact that the 7 barracks located in the Defence Forces Training Centre are named after the signatories of the proclamation: Pearse, Clark, McDiarmid, Connolly, MacDonagh, Kent and Plunkett barracks all make up the Defence Forces Training Centre. With 3 helicopters of the Air Corps under the command of Captain Owen Marshall. 3 of them in view there. And as I mentioned earlier, all the aircraft flown by the Air Corps will join in a final fly past with the last serial of troops which march up along O'Connell Street. Great view of it through the Larkin.
And also
Monument.
just to remind people that the bands will perform for the public in St. Stephen's Green this afternoon. So that's something to look forward to for people who are going to be in the city later on.
We're looking at members of the Army Ranger Wing, specialist forces of the Defence Forces as they pass by in a Ford Special Reconnaissance Vehicle. Of course, members of the Army Ranger Wing, the elite forces of the Defence Forces, have been deployed on some very, very tough international peacekeeping missions through East Timor and Liberia, and have served with great distinction on these missions. At the moment, members of the Irish Ranger Wing on view to the public.
And when they went to East Timor, they were very greatly received. The Australian Major General Cosgrove, who was commander of the international force there, said, "You came from Ireland to help a beleaguered people who could not help themselves." And he said he was daily uplifted and inspired to see the easy courage and iron discipline the Irish Defence Forces showed to those who wished them evil, and also the Rangers' compassion and kindness to those in need.
Looking at Scorpion light armoured vehicles, 4 of them from the Armoured Car Squadron, also based in the Curragh Command Training Centre, the Defence Forces Training Centre based. Muid bhreanú ríist saigurí speisialta na Warsaw Cosanta an na fianógaí mar thugtar orb atá bunaithe le Ronald Trainala ó chora an seo agus Scorpion armoured cars an sin a bhfuil dábhacht amach sé a bhfuil thar anad fire nó seo sráidí chun.
And we were talking earlier about the women and their involvement in 1916. Some names that would be familiar, like Julia Grennan, Elizabeth O'Farrell, Winnie Carney, Kathleen Lynn, Dr. Kathleen Lynn, who described herself as a Red Cross doctor and a belligerent, and who went on subsequently to found St. Ultan's Hospital.
A view of a dismounted patrol from the MOAGs. MOAG is capable of affording protection to approximately 9 soldiers fully laden, as we view them marching or patrolling as they would on overseas service with the Defence Forces. I'm also reminded, looking at the modern equipment that the Irish soldiers carry today, their forefathers in 1916 entered the GPO with some out-of-date weaponry, so much so, and in fact some of the volunteers who rose up in 1916 had never fired a rifle before, and reported that the recoil was so heavy in some of the antiquated and obsolete weapons that they had that it knocked them across the room and indeed unconscious on some occasions.
It is used by soldiers to protect against armour. The communications equipment they are carrying includes the Fingar frequency hopping long-range radio and the personal roll radio, which is carried by all soldiers and used to transmit messages over short distance.
Modern soldiers are always carry personal communication equipment, but as Mary was saying, the role played by the women in 1916 was an awful lot of time as dispatch messenger carriers, and were ingenious in some of the activities, some of them rolling the messages up into their hair and in their buns as they were able to evade capture by the British soldiers. And indeed some of them were captured and managed to eat the message that they were carrying. Of course, modern defence forces rely very much so on frequency hopping radios and all sorts of jamming and sophisticated communication devices. But in 1916 things were very, very much different. So the ladies in Dublin during 1916 were certainly no ordinary women.
No, they were described by an eyewitness as being of all ranks, from titled ladies to shop assistants, who worked on terms of easy equality. And by the end of the week there were about 40 women in the GPO.
The Air Defence Regiment are now passing the viewing stand, and they are displaying 2 L-70 anti-aircraft guns. These guns have a 40mm.
An RBS-70 anti-aircraft, low-level anti-aircraft missile of the Air Defence Regiment on the float there, provided by the Defence Forces Training Centre. .5 heavy machine gun passing by there, an 81mm mortar, and a javelin, a man-portable fire and forget smart missile, anti-tank smart missile. We're looking at a flycatcher, which is an air acquisition radar system.
And now we have representatives from the United Nations Training School. Ireland became a member of the United Nations in 1955, and since then Defence Forces personnel have completed more than 55,000 tours of duty abroad. The training school is a centre of excellence for human rights training in the Defence Forces, and they have courses on international and humanitarian law and the law of armed conflict.
We've got some L-60s from the Air Defence Regiment. These are Bofors, 40mm guns, which are deployed with the Air Defence Regiment. So Mary was talking about the United Nations Training School there. United Nations School shares the information and experience gathered by Irish troops on overseas service with other nations who have just recently become involved in peacekeeping operations around the world. They would include members of the British Army, the US Army and the French and other European armed forces.
Now the next serial represents the Air Corps and the Naval Service, and you can see them there just coming into O'Connell Street, passing by the statue of Daniel O'Connell, just over the bridge there.
looking at the Naval Service and the flag officer, Lieutenant Pat Doherty, leading the Naval Service contingent. Of course, Naval Service based in Hallbowlan. And we're also there in the middle of that group is the Naval Chaplain, Father Des Campion, who is no stranger to the Defence Forces, himself with 7 tours of duty overseas. And both his relatives and his family have served with the Defence Forces. Indeed, some of them marched here in O'Connell Street with the Defence Forces. One cowley in Yumlon ag Kervish cowley in Ishagus on the dirt wine Lungana exo and Father Shokamala Kulpaka on Kervish cowley Agin Des in Shinrish Lorish and they am Brodul at in Shervish Dealish Tatukiega Hain, I guess a going in winter on the Warsi cousin.
And the roles of the Naval Service include fishery protection, of course, drug interdiction, pollution control, search and rescue, and troop resupply. Approximately 1,100 personnel in the Naval Service, of which 6% are female.
Various colours of the naval vessels, a total 8 naval vessels in the Naval Service. And also that reminds us of the past that during 1916 a naval vessel, the Helga, wreaked havoc on the centre of Dublin City and the GPO in particular when the gunboat attacked Liberty Hall on her way up to Liffey, but also the GPO itself with her guns from the naval vessel. And I suppose in a strange twist of fate, the new Free State took over the Helga and renamed it the L.E. Muraku and was used for fishery protection until it was scrapped or decommissioned in the late 40s. And you know, O'Connell, look at Quinal Soul and shot at Barrett, David Harris, come a key to come a chat. Had a Brodul at the Porcy Cossington, New Hampshire, a tar, a fine key shop. But you better know it, he had under the on air code, and Kirksos right.
There are 100 Air Corps personnel marching in service dress uniform, and then 10 pilots marching in their flight suits.
Took 3 flights from the Ministerial Air Service of the Air Corps.
And Owen was talking there about the destruction that the Helga, the gunship, wrecked on Liberty Hall and the GPO. And by Thursday night, they were describing it as a roaring, the sound of the flames, a roaring as of a gigantic waterfall re-echoing from the walls of the GPO. Then there were the flames from the Imperial Hotel and all over Sackville Street. They were so fierce that they almost touched the walls of the GPO. The heat was so great that men had to actually be employed to keep the window fortifications drenched with water so that the sandbags and the sacks would go on fire.
Following the Air Corps on parade there, and who look splendidly in their blue uniforms, we have members of the physical training, some physical training instructors of the Defence Forces, a total of 30 on parade, representing many of the units of the Defence Force. Of course, physical training is a key and vital element of the modern Defence Forces.
And the instructors actually have to complete a 22-week course in order to qualify as instructors.
On the Kjol, the Shechon in Chur, is yet Teen and Marshall in your son, Commemorate, Tawadiana, and Idi Magna Cosca, Akas Hamaleshin, a Mauru Wunch Hama, Gorosai Jury, Argora, Ball, Guna, Gorda Shechona, and Sherbish, Harriar, Lesson Nashun Hen, Hama.
The Garda Band, always very popular, conducted by Inspector Pat Kenny, who's the present musical director. There's been 7 so far of the Garda Band. It was established in 1922.
One member of the Garda Síochána died while on UN peacekeeping service, Sergeant Paul Reid, RIP, who died in Sarajevo in 1995. Like the members of the Defence Forces who died on overseas service. They are also, and he is also remembered here today.
There's Inspector Pat Kenny leading the Garda band.
They're playing Are You Right There, Murray, all right. Garda David Bracken, native of Dublin, is carrying, and who's stationed at Malahide Garda Station, is carrying the Garda flag.
And all the Gardaí selected to march in the parade have served on UN or EU missions, and they range in rank from Chief Superintendent to Garda.
View of the huge crowd just assembled here. Lovely day in Dublin to view this parade commemorating those who rose up on behalf of Irish freedom in 1916, and also dual commemoration of Irish men and women, Gardaí and side duty, who served overseas with the United Nations.
These are the members of the 4th Western Brigade making up the 7th Ferial. Music appropriately O'Donnell Lebu and the Men of the West.
Members of the 4th Western Brigade are drawn from an area from Athlone, West Galway, and north to Donegal. 3 Tournament Defence Forces Company on parade today, and 3 Reserve Defence Forces Company on parade from the Western Brigade. The Western Brigade is under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Michael Kennedy, who is the officer commanding the 6th Infantry Battalion. Not in view there at the moment, but Sergeant Major Don Toomey, who is the Sergeant Major of the 6th Infantry Battalion, was an escort to the national flag the last time that the 1916 Rising was commemorated here. Of course, Sergeant Major John Toomey, a native of Tullamore, but I'm sure he's a much younger sergeant in those days, was proudly parading with his unit here today. Paráid leis an canasíocht ar Brigade an Éitir ar an Níochar, atá an Carú Brigade an Níochar, tá saidirí ó chéad Chathaláin coisithe, Chathaláin atá lunaí a dún I bhfuilís an Gaile, agus ar nó líam I bhfuilís hain a bhí Port-Lárnach aige an éirí amach na Cásca, agus bhí féimú I Níochar na tíre, agus an chéad Chathaláin coisithe tá fuistúr an Cameron Gary McKeown in well, tá an tradiisiún go núsáidin siad sin gailge sa Chathaláin sin, agus cinnneann sin go leor achtaíocht a Connemara agus I limistéir siar. CASA chuid an Air Corps sin, CASA aircraft of the Air Corps in view, CASA used for fishery protection vessels and provide a vital seeing eye to the naval service in protecting our valuable fishing resources.
And the formation is being led by Commandant Ronan Burling. He's actually from West Cork, and he's been in the Defence Forces for 16 years, and as well as being a pilot, he happens to be a keen sailor, and he's taken part in 2 Round Ireland yacht races and also the Passage race.
parade from the 4th Western Brigade reserve units are the 5th, 51st, 56th and 58th battalions, companies from the three battalions on parade under the command of Commandant Kevin O'Connor, Commandant Tony McCrath and Commandant Peter McKenna.
And the reserve Defence Forces have such a diversification of skills and occupations in their company. Within the ranks you'll find students, teachers, lecturers, tradespeople, managers, fishermen and farmers. People from all walks of life.
Great honour for the 2,500 soldiers selected to parade here today as a representative, a grouping of the 22,600 men and women who make up the Permanent and the Reserve Defence Forces as they proudly march along O'Connell Street today with all their modern equipment. So we're looking again at MOWAG armoured cars belonging to the 4th Western Brigade. Some formation of helicopters from the Air Corps, some Eurocopter and Alouette helicopters, and I think some fixed-wing Cessnas leading that particular formation in view at the moment. Larkin and Shin agus Mitchell Shin on Air Corps, Getchel Cheese, Straji Hunna. Would you bedan when the MOAGs at East in Shaw or Canasiach? Yefer agus two Biaru could Shasko Cood MOAGs the Shelby Slash the Warsi Cossanta, Vilahad Killa at Outdo, yet Jensis and Elvesha could see the Churt Gullor or a Churt Cossant. Rehabachtach go saidúí na tíre seo agus iad Shelby Harlia.
And also taking part in the Western Brigade are Defence Forces personnel from Column Barracks in Mullingar. And it's interesting that it was an incident in the period leading up to the Civil War that gave the barracks its name. 27th of April 1922, Company Adjutant Patrick Collum of Columkillen, County Longford was killed in Mullingar, and he was one of a party engaged in an attempt to free 9 men being held by anti-treaty forces. He was 20 years old, and Column Barracks have been named after him.
105mm artillery guns from Column Barracks, 4th Field Artillery Regiment, there in view with their support vehicles. Howitzers from the 4th Field Artillery Regiment, Mullingar, Column Barracks, Mullingar, County Strike Hunna, who were all war Bally in Churnish, Brown the Weshaw, or down the Quitting Law Brow, Concho, Strike Hunna, Inshallah clear. I just tell a Quitting Air Corps, because more do that. Hitch him on their flat like Hitchel more on the one and I think they don't God caution but it's good to challenge side university because of the technical change and right gala or yes with the people who is right for
Well, now we have the representation from the Army Equitation School. The Irish Defence Forces riders have been the backbone of Irish show jumping and event teams since its inception. They've done their bit to helped the Irish team to many Aga Khan Trophy successes, and they also perform, of course, at venues like Aachen, Calgary, Washington and Toronto.
Tapia, the chuid scoil Mackie, the Warsi Cosanta, Agus Maradur Mary, and that on the call, international Bank Mach Club, Commortish Ecosula, Foot down, and say, Port Lornach, Darnoy. Imri Jacob, a Tarrant call, Latvia, the Hayden, Foot down.
They're getting a very nice welcome from the spectators who've gathered here on O'Connell Street to watch this parade.
Final serial of the brigade formation that has passed through O'Connell Street is a combination of the mass bands, the Army No. 1 band, the band of the Southern Brigade, the band of the 4th Western Brigade, and the mass pipes and drums of the Defence Forces. This is accompanied by a complete formation fly past by the Air Corps involving Kazas, Alouettes, Eurocopters, Gulfstream 4, Learjets, Beechcraft, Pilatus, Cessnas, and as I mentioned, Pilatus aircraft.
And the massed bands include, of course, the Army No. 1 band, the band of the 1st Southern Brigade, the band of the 4th Western Brigade, and the pipes and drums. And the music, St. Patrick's Day, Gary Owen, the Kinnegad Slashers, and On the Square. And the bands will be, well, not on the square, they'll be at the bandstand in St. Stephen's Green at 4 o'clock this afternoon to entertain members of the public.
Leading the band, Gallus, Lewis Stewart in the band, and Lipton Cornyard Friend of Power, and Comfort Mark Armstrong, August and Captain Declan Whitfield. Agus with the brand new Arab, Virgin Arab, because he had the Marshall Chiefs, Strody Hunnel, Agus Hulaguna, Tabalin Shaw, a bind Saucer, as in to sponsors Intach Shaw, or the Forcy Cousin Ted Fall, Mark Homora, Hove Shood, a Hassuas, a Son Shiachan, the Hayden, the Nidiag, Shady, agus meawrú chomá na saidúrí chuid a tháinig mar chomharba orb siúd agus an seirbhí se thug sé sin an ainm na héireann fud an domhan faoi bhratach na náisiúnéal. Puibirí na héanaid éagsúla ó na Warsaí Constantin seo. Chuid go Air Corps an teirgis Cowley agus saidúrí cosí a Mackie a leithí a
As I was saying, all here to commemorate the men and women who fought and died in 1916. And as Tom Clark said to his wife Kathleen, the first blow has been struck and Ireland will get her freedom. Very uplifting music there, and the crowds are actually on their feet applauding as the bands go by, and you can see the delight on the face of President McAleese.
And now the President leaves the reviewing stand. Her escort there comes into view from beside the GPO. The motorcycle escort provided by the Army, which accompanies the President on state occasions. Her departure now signalling the conclusion of this morning's ceremonies, in which we have seen something not seen on the streets of Dublin or any other Irish town or city for more than 30 years. A parade of this magnitude of the men and women of Óglaigh na hÉireann. And a round of applause for the President as she gets into the car now and prepares to be driven back to our Throne. And perhaps at this moment, at the conclusion of this military parade, we may recall the words of William Butler Yeats, who wrote in Easter 1916, when the memory of these events was fresh to him and so many others across this country.
Ladies and gentlemen, the standing stage, would you please be seated for a number of moments?
Wherever green is worn, he wrote, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born.